The day my son-in-law handed me a manila envelope across the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten breakfast for 31 years, I thought he was giving me paperwork for the refinance we'd talked about. I actually smiled at him. I remember that. I remember smiling. Inside was a letter from an attorney I'd never heard of, informing me that the property at 44112 Birchwood Lane, the house my wife Loretta and I had built together, the house where we raised our daughter, where I'd repainted the porch every 3 years without fail, where I'd buried our old beagle Chester under the oak tree in the backyard. That property was no longer considered part of my wife's estate, that it had been transferred quietly 18 months before her death into a family trust I had no knowledge of, no access to, and no legal standing to contest. Or so they claimed. He watched me read it. He just sat there with his coffee, watching. I want to tell you something before I go any further. I am 63 years old. I spent 34 years working as a structural engineer for the county. I never missed a mortgage payment. I never once asked my daughter or her husband for a single thing. When Loretta got sick, and she was sick for a long time, longer than most people knew, I took early retirement to care for her. I cashed out part of my 401k to cover the treatments her insurance wouldn't touch. I did all of it without complaint, because that's what you do. That's what I believed marriage and family meant. I had no idea that while I was watching my wife sleep in a hospital bed, counting her breaths, my son-in-law and my daughter were meeting with a private estate attorney 40 minutes away. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because I've had to sit with it every single day for the past 2 years. Loretta passed on a Tuesday in March. Crocus were just starting to come up in the front bed. She loved those flowers. She'd planted them herself years ago and used to say the fact that they came back every spring without being told to was proof that the world still had some sense to it. I stood at the window and watched them come up 3 days after the funeral, and I thought she'd have liked that. I had 2 weeks of peace. That's it, 2 weeks. Then my daughter Gail called and asked if she and her husband could come over to talk about next steps. I thought she meant grief. I thought she was worried about me rattling around alone in a big house. I told her, of course, come on over. I'll make coffee. Her husband's name is Troy Bassett. He's the kind of man who has a firm handshake for everyone but means it for no one. He sells commercial real estate, and he's good at it, which tells you everything you need to know about how he sees other people. I never disliked him exactly. I just never fully trusted the way he looked at things, including my daughter, like they were line items on a spreadsheet. They sat down at that kitchen table, and Troy did most of the talking. Gail barely looked at me. He explained, in the measured tone of someone who has rehearsed this, that the house needed to go to market, that the estate had debts, that they had a fiduciary responsibility to the trust. He used the word fiduciary 4 times. I counted. I told him I didn't know anything about a trust. He slid the envelope across the table. I asked Gail, while Troy was still talking, I just looked at her and said, "Did you know about this while your mother was still alive?" She looked at the window, not at me, at the window. That was my answer. They gave me 60 days to vacate. Troy said it very reasonably, said they hated to put a timeline on it, but the market window in spring was significant, and they'd already spoken to a realtor. He used the word significant. 60 days to leave the home I'd lived in for 3 decades. 60 days to pack up 31 years of a life I thought I understood. I didn't tell anyone at first. I was ashamed, I think, in a way I'm not fully proud of. Ashamed that I hadn't seen it. Ashamed that my own child had sat across a lawyer's desk and signed papers that would put her father out of his home, and I'd had no idea. I kept thinking about all the times I'd defended her to Loretta when they argued. I kept thinking about her wedding. I'd cried at her wedding. I'd cried at her wedding. Full-on cried, not just a glassy eye, and I hadn't even been embarrassed about it. I stayed with my buddy Al for a couple weeks, told him I was having some work done on the house. Al's been my friend since 1987. He knew I was lying, but he didn't push, and I loved him for it. At some point, I had to face the reality that I had no legal claim, or at least that's what the letter said. I called 2 attorneys. The first one told me the trust documents, if properly executed, were going to be hard to challenge. The second one said basically the same thing, but charged me $300 to say it. I was running out of money to throw at a problem I didn't fully understand yet. I started going through Loretta's things. I'd been avoiding it the way you do, but now I needed to. I needed to understand what had happened. I went through her files. She kept everything in a fireproof box in the bedroom closet, organized by year with little sticky tabs she made herself, and I sat on the floor of that closet for about 4 hours. That's when I found the second insurance policy. I had known about it. Loretta had taken it out 11 years ago, through her employer's supplemental benefits program, and she'd never mentioned it. I don't say that as a criticism, we weren't secretive people, but she handled certain paperwork, and I handled others. It was just how we divided things. The policy was a $400,000 term life policy. The beneficiary line had my name on it. Just my name. Not the trust. Not Gail. I stared at that document for a long time. I didn't know what it meant yet, but something shifted in me. Some door I'd thought was locked started to feel like maybe it hadn't been properly latched. I called Al that night. I told him everything. He was quiet for a minute, and then he said, "You need to talk to someone who knows insurance law, not just estate law." Al had retired from the county clerk's office, and he knew people. 2 days later, he gave me a name, a woman named Iris Fontaine who worked out of a small office in Decatur. Not flashy. Website looked like it was built in 2009. But Al said she was the sharpest person he'd ever seen read a contract. I drove to Decatur on a Thursday morning with the insurance policy, Loretta's fireproof box, and the manila envelope Troy had handed me. I sat in a waiting room that smelled like burned coffee and old carpet, and I filled out her intake form. I was 62 years old, and I was filling out a form to find out if I had any rights left. Iris Fontaine was not what I expected. She was maybe 50, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had the kind of direct eye contact that made you feel like she was running a scan on you while you talked. She read everything I gave her without saying a word. She asked 3 questions, then she was quiet again. Finally she said, "Did your wife have any cognitive decline in the 18 months before she passed?" I told her yes. Toward the end, yes. There were months where she got confused, where she'd forget conversations. The doctors said it was partly the medication, partly the disease progression. Iris wrote something down. She said, "The trust was executed 14 months before she died. You're telling me she was showing cognitive symptoms within that same window?" I said, "That's correct." She said, "And you had no knowledge of the trust, signed no documents, and were not listed as a party to it?" "Correct." She said, "In Georgia, a surviving spouse has statutory rights to an elective share of the estate regardless of how assets were titled. The trust may not fully shield those assets from your claim, particularly if we can demonstrate your wife lacked full capacity or was unduly influenced at the time of signing." I didn't understand all of it, but I understood unduly influenced. I understood statutory rights, and I understood the way she said it, not like a sales pitch, like a woman telling me a weather forecast. Factual, certain. She agreed to take the case. What followed was 8 months that I would not wish on anyone. I won't pretend it was clean or fast. There were depositions. There were moments where I sat in a conference room across from my daughter and couldn't recognize the person looking back at me. Troy had hired a very expensive attorney from a firm in Atlanta. He had a way of phrasing things that made me feel small. Iris had a way of phrasing things that made him feel stupid, so I considered it balanced. There were documents subpoenaed from the estate attorney who drafted the trust. His records showed that the initial consultation had happened without me present, obviously, but more importantly, that a second meeting had been scheduled because the estate attorney himself had flagged concerns about Loretta's ability to fully comprehend the documents. Those notes were in his file. He'd written them to protect himself. He'd never expected anyone to go looking. Iris went looking. There was also the matter of Loretta's primary care physician, who had documented her cognitive symptoms dating back further than Troy and Gail had claimed. They had told the court that Loretta's decline was rapid and only apparent in the final weeks. The medical records told a different story, a much longer, much quieter story, about a woman whose capacity was eroding, while her husband took her to chemo appointments and her daughter was apparently in meetings with a real estate attorney. The case didn't go to full trial. 6 weeks before the scheduled date, Troy's attorney reached out to Iris about a settlement. "I'll tell you what we got. I'll be straight about it because I think you deserve the straight version. The house went to market, but I received 40% of the net sale proceeds, which came to just over $190,000. The insurance policy paid out in full $400,000 to me as the named beneficiary, which was never in dispute once Iris filed the claim properly. The estate was also required to reimburse a portion of my legal fees and what Iris calculated as the value of my caregiving labor during Loretta's illness. Something called a caregiver restitution argument that I hadn't known was a legal concept, but apparently is, and apparently courts take seriously when properly documented. Total, when everything was resolved, a little over $680,000. Enough to buy a modest house outright in the town where I grew up, in Alabama, with money left over. Enough to breathe. I want to tell you what that number meant to me, and I want to be honest about it. It wasn't satisfaction. Not exactly. I keep waiting for the satisfaction, and it keeps not quite arriving. What arrived instead was something quieter, a sense that I had not allowed myself to be erased, that the 34 years of my marriage had not been successfully rewritten by a man with a firm handshake and an Atlanta attorney. Loretta's policy had my name on it. She put my name on it. 11 years ago, quietly, through her employer's HR portal, in some ordinary moment between meetings or on a lunch break, she put my name on a document. I don't know if she knew it would matter. I don't know if she had some intuition about what might come later. I'll never know that. But she did it, and it was the thing that held. There's something I need to say about Gail. She is my daughter. That doesn't stop being true. I've thought about this more than I've thought about anything except Loretta herself. I've turned it over in every possible light, the way you do with something you can't put down. And what I've come to is this. I don't know how much of what happened was Troy and how much was her. I don't know if she walked into it fully or was walked into it gradually. I know that she didn't look at me. I know that when the settlement was signed, she sent a text message, not a call, a text, that said, "I hope we can find a way through this someday, Dad." I didn't respond. Not yet. I'm not ready. Maybe I will be eventually. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that I live now in a small brick house on a street called Caldwell, in a town I haven't lived in since I was 22 years old. I have a porch. I have a neighbor named Barb who brings over sweet tea in a mason jar sometimes, for no particular reason. I have a dog, a 7-year-old rescue mutt named Franklin, who sleeps at the foot of my bed and has no concept of any of this, which is honestly one of the more comforting things in my life right now. I joined a grief group at the Methodist church down the block, mostly because Al told me I had to talk to someone, and Al is right about most things. There are 8 of us who meet on Tuesday evenings. Nobody in that room has the same story, but we all have the same particular kind of tired, the kind that comes not just from loss, but from having to keep fighting through the loss, from not being allowed to just grieve cleanly. A man in that group, a retired teacher named George, said something a few weeks ago that I've been thinking about ever since. He said, "Grief is not a wall you get over. It's a river you learn to ford. And some days the current is low and you cross easy, and some days it knocks you flat. And the trick is to stop being surprised by either one." I've been knocked flat a lot. I've also crossed easy sometimes, more easy than I expected, honestly. I still think about those crocuses. If you're watching this and you're in the middle of something like what I went through, if your own family has done something you didn't see coming, if you're sitting somewhere right now holding a piece of paper that's trying to tell you you don't matter, that the life you built doesn't count, I want you to hear this. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't tend towards speeches, but I will tell you plainly, do not accept the first version of the story someone else hands you. Go through the boxes. Make the calls. Find your Iris Fontaine. There is almost always something that was put there for you. that the other side didn't count on. Almost always, Loretta put my name on that document. She didn't know I'd need it. Or maybe she did. Or maybe it doesn't matter. Either way, it held. I think about the fireproof box a lot. Loretta bought it at a hardware store sometime in the early 2000s, labeled every folder herself with those little sticky tabs, and put it in the back of the closet like it was nothing, like it was just housekeeping. She had no idea, or maybe she did, I'll never know, that the thing sitting in that box would be the reason I still have a life to speak of. There's a version of the story where I never open that box, where I take the manila envelope at face value, believe the letter, and walk away from everything I built because someone handed me a document and used the word fiduciary with enough confidence that I didn't push back. That version of me is out there somewhere. I feel sorry for him. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is that the outcomes in our lives are rarely random. Troy and Gail made choices, quiet ones, deliberate ones, choices that require planning and attorneys and signatures, and those choices produced consequences they didn't anticipate because they assumed I wouldn't look closely enough. They counted on shame and grief doing their work for them, and for a while it almost did. But here's the thing about doing right by someone for 34 years. It leaves a record. Loretta's policy had my name on it because she was a woman of integrity who never fully trusted the people around her the way I did. Her moral instinct was sharper than mine. She put my name on that document not because she was planning for betrayal, but because she understood, at some quiet level, that honesty requires paperwork. That love without documentation is just a story anyone can rewrite. I'm not a man who has ever been accused of being particularly clever. I was an engineer. I understood load-bearing structures and stress tolerances and how to keep things from falling down. What I didn't understand until Iris Fontaine sat across from me in that office in Decatur was that the law rewards the people who read carefully, who ask the next question, who don't accept the first version of the story. Intelligence, real intelligence, the useful kind, isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about knowing when you don't know enough and going to find someone who does. That's what Al gave me when he gave me Iris's name, not a lawyer, a direction, a reason to keep moving when grief was doing its level best to keep me still. And that's the part I want you to sit with if you're somewhere in the middle of something hard. Not the settlement number, not the legal victory. The part where I was 62 years old, sleeping on a friend's couch, too ashamed to tell the truth. And I made myself get up and drive to Decatur anyway. That drive, that intake form, that burned coffee waiting room. That's the whole story, really. Everything else followed from that one decision to not quit on myself. Strength, the kind that actually holds, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's the thing that makes you open the box when you'd rather not. That makes you make the call when you're sure it won't matter. That keeps you decent when the people around you have stopped being decent to you. I stayed honest throughout all of it. I didn't lie in depositions. I didn't play games. I just told the truth and let Iris do the rest. Franklin was asleep at my feet the night the settlement was finalized. He didn't know. He just knew I was home. And that was enough for him. Some days that's enough for me too.